Two Journeys Ministry with Pastor Andy Davis. Biblical teaching to guide you to spiritual maturity.
Welcome to the Two Journeys Bible Study Podcast. This is episode 3 in our Romans Bible Study podcast entitled The Greatest Earthly Judgment, Given Over to Sin, where we'll discuss Romans chapter 1, verses 26 through 32. I'm Wes Treadway, and I'm here with Pastor Andy Davis. Andy, what are we going to see in these verses that we're looking at today?
Well, this is a very devastating section of Scripture in which Paul, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, is laying out why it is that every single person on earth needs the gospel, which is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes. And it's a long section, Romans 1:18 through chapter 3, verse really 23, that walks all of us through that. But we're at a section now where, as you mentioned, it talks about the devastation and the greatest earthly judgment that there can be for sin, which is God giving individuals over to their sin. And so we're going to walk through that. And at the end of this chapter 1, we have a very lengthy list of sins, which even itself is not exhaustive or comprehensive, but very suggestive of how broad the effect of sin has been on the human race. So we're going to walk through that today.
Let me go ahead and read verses 26 through 32 in Romans chapter 1. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind, to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. Andy, this section describes the second deadly exchange we see here in Romans 1. What is the exchange here, and what's the connection between the first exchange and this second one?
Well, the first exchange was idolatry. The second exchange is natural, healthy sexual function. And so the connection between the two is Paul is making it clear, God is making it clear through Paul that people knew God. They are aware of God through creation, and not just in terms of what's external to us. As we look around at nature, we look around at the creation, at the stars, the mountains, the oceans, animals, everything. But also we'll see in chapter 2 within us, the moral code within us and our conscience. Anyway, people knew God, but they didn't glorify Him as God or give thanks to Him. They turned away. They didn't want Him. They don't love Him. They didn't want Him. And so they want something else. And what they wanted else, the first exchange was a god of their own making, a god of their own crafting, idolatry. And he said in this part now, because of this or for this reason, then we have the second exchange. So it's this: the great sin is not loving and wanting God and turning away from that, and not, as he'll say in verse 28, they did not see fit to retain the knowledge of God, meaning it's not worthwhile. It wasn't worth it to them to hold on to the knowledge of God. They denigrated it as something hostile or cheap or offensive. And so all of this is judgment from God. I think it goes back to verse 18. The wrath of God is put on display every day in this. And if you know what to look for, you look around at a world that is ever increasingly wicked, and that's evidence of the verses here. God is giving people over to their sin. He's not interfering with them. He's not stopping them. He's just letting them do it. Mm-hmm. And so this second exchange is healthy, godly, holy sexual function, which we need to understand is a gift of God within marriage, very clearly given. The man and his wife were naked, and they were not ashamed and had no reason for shame. And they were told, be fruitful and multiply. And we know how that happens through marital relations. But they didn't want to hold on to that, and they jumped the boundaries and fences and went into things that were forbidden. And that's the second exchange, sexual immorality.
Now, right here at the beginning of verse 26, we get the judgment. It says God gave them up. Andy, how does God do this while not directly tempting people to sin?
It's a mystery to me, but I think there's a sense of a sovereign and holy passivity where he steps out of the way and lets people fall of their own weight, kind of thing. He lets them go in the direction they want to go. The greatest example of this, in my opinion, is God effectively tempting Satan to kill his own son. He's dangling Jesus, the incarnation, right in front of Satan, and Satan has the power through his human puppets to kill him, and he can't stop himself. And he has to kill him, thereby destroying his own dark kingdom. And so I think in the same way, God allows people to do what they want to do. He gives them over to their desires. He does not tempt anyone to do evil, ever. We're told that in James. He doesn't pull people toward doing evil things. He just doesn't stop them. And they work together. People who are crafting and laying snares for people for their own benefit. We think about, in this case, we're talking about sexual immorality. So those that are doing internet pornography, or they're setting up active systems of temptation, in this way, that's a pattern of God giving people over to them. The whole system is tending toward more and more evil and sin. And, it's devastating because in verse 26, it says, God gave them over. In my translation, it says to shameful lusts. And we need to understand, we're openly, directly talking about homosexuality here. Let's not beat around the bush. It's very, very clear. There are many forms of sexual immorality. Heterosexual fornication is sexual immorality. And the lust within it is a shameful lust. But the shameful lust that Paul talks about here is women exchanging natural relations for unnatural ones, and in the same way, men abandoning natural relations with women and being inflamed with lust for one another. So we know exactly what he's talking about. This is what homosexuality is. It's individuals of the same gender biologically loving each other as should only be across gender and in the context of marriage. And it's called, in my translation, shameful lust. I don't know what yours says in verse 26.
Verse 26 says dishonorable passions.
Dishonorable, all right? So this is, and we know that with the LGBT drive going on in our culture today, Pride Month, June in America is so-called Pride Month, and they're calling it something that they're proud of, but this verse says you ought not to be. It's shameful. It's dishonorable. And so we're being retrained by society and the slogan is love is love. And frankly, you ought to be ashamed if you oppose any form of love. But the fact of the matter is these lusts, these desires are shameful. And so that the issue of same-sex attraction, we need to understand all sin begins with a lust, with a yearning, a desire for something you ought not to have. Theft begins that way, begins with a covetous heart. And so it is with sexual immorality. It starts with, in the case of heterosexual adultery, David on the roof looking at another man's wife while she's bathing. And that's, I think, what the Bible would call a shameful lust. It's something you ought not to have. But the context here is homosexuality. So if we look at the issue of same-sex attraction, it is not okay to burn with lust for someone of your own sex. And so some Christians these days are saying same-sex attraction is not a sin. What matters is that you don't act on it. But that's just not true, because Jesus said, if you look at a woman lustfully, you've committed adultery with her in your heart. Why does he even talk about that? Now, that's heterosexual. But the fact is you can and often do, and I would say usually do, sin with your heart without moving a muscle. And so we can't just stand idly by and say to an individual who is burning with what this Bible calls a dishonorable passion that it's fine. Instead, like all of us, we all have to put thought sins to death, don't we? We have to pour water of holiness on the fire of our lusts and our passions and put them out. And so it must be with the issue of same-sex attraction.
So we have the description of what God has given them up to, but we also have their attitude toward it and the consequence of it. It says at the end of verse 27 that men are committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. What is Paul talking about here in the latter part of verse 27?
Oh, brother, there's so many things to talk about here. To answer the question you just asked, it seems to be maybe sexually transmitted diseases, maybe like AIDS, other things like that. Seems to be in their bodies they have this due penalty. There's a certain disease penalty for sexual immorality. So it could be that. But going back to, there's a statement Paul makes here. These are just, all of these words here are potent and important for our day. The idea of dishonorable passions or shameful lust is important for the question of same-sex attraction. But also this issue of the women exchanging natural relations for unnatural ones. So here we have the issue of nature. Paul uses the word phusis, which has to do with what is evident and clear in the biology. And we're so gender confused these days. I mean, we're not. I've never been confused. But our culture is, or it's pushing confusion on us with this whole transgender thing where somebody can identify as something other than what they're biologically built to do. No one can deny the biology. They don't. But they just say there's a difference between, I don't know what words they use, sex and gender. I don't know if those are the technical terms, but the idea is your biology, you can't change that, although people do surgeries to change it sometimes. It's very tragic. But it's what you identify as, that's your gender, you're identifying as is. But Paul's arguing from nature here. It's clear and evident what was meant to be. A man and a woman in a one flesh union in the covenant of marriage for the sake of procreation, also for marital joy and pleasure. That's God's intention. So nature matters. Paul's arguing from nature here. And the women are exchanging natural relations for unnatural ones. And in the same way, men are doing the same thing. So he's arguing from nature on both sides of the equation. And they receive in themselves the due penalty, it says, for their perversion. Also, the men statement, what does your thing say about what the men did?
Committing shameless acts with men.
Shameless, my translation says indecent. It's the same thing. It's dishonorable, shameful. There's some things of which we should be ashamed.
Yeah.
And that's the point here. Men committed indecent acts. Now, the thing that's so beautiful, I want to share this. The grace of God, this is all in the context of the gospel. And Paul says in Corinthians, such were some of you. It is possible to become an ex-homosexual. And it is possible to become no longer ashamed. No longer ashamed. Now, I think there's always going to be ashamed to some degree because it says in Romans 6, what benefit did you reap at that time from the things of which you are now ashamed? So there's going to be a continued shame in one sense. I think it's like when you burn your hand on the stove as a young boy, you remember the pain the rest of your life and don't do that again. So there's a use for shame. But here's the thing. What's so beautiful is if you're a Christian, Christ positionally has taken away all your shame. Before God, there's no shame. And there will be no shame on Judgment Day when he says, welcome you who are blessed into the eternal kingdom prepared for you by my Father. He will take away all the shame. And so it says in this book of Romans, anyone who trusts in him will never be put to shame. So Jesus has the power to take away the shame. But if you've not yet been converted, this text is saying you ought to be ashamed of homosexuality. And it's clear that there is a shamefulness to it. Just like there's shamefulness to murder, shamefulness to theft, shamefulness to heterosexual adultery or fornication. There's shame in all of those things. There's shame for all sin.
You know, it's amazing just thinking about the cultural implications of this for us and even for Paul in his day. He's telling them, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, but culture would have me be.
Right.
And there are people who are not ashamed of their sin, but they ought to be. And it's just a powerful reminder that our world, under the influence of our enemy, Satan, is pushing us to be ashamed of those things that we ought not, God's word, the gospel, but calling us to do shameful things and do them shamelessly, as we see here in these first two verses.
Yeah, and how ironic. I did mention Pride Month, and it reminds me of it as well known in Isaiah. It says, woe to them, they don't know how to be ashamed, they don't know how to blush. They parade their sin like Sodom, and they're proud of it, and they ought not to be. And here's the thing, I think it's it's like having a hardened conscience or a seared conscience. I think people get to the point where they just don't feel anything about it anymore. And I think that's evidence of God giving somebody over to their sins when they just don't feel anything. They're actually proud of it. And you ought to be ashamed that you don't support me. Mm-hmm. You ought to be ashamed if you don't get on board with Pride Month. Yeah. Something's wrong with you. Well, this is just a satanic trick. So and here's the thing, we as Christians need to be clear-minded about this. Sin kills eternally. Mm. So imagine if you had a son or daughter or a friend who comes out of the closet, so to speak, as used to be said, I don't know if that phrase is still used, but declares themselves to be a homosexual and wants you to not just acknowledge it, but to embrace it and celebrate it. Mm. Think of it this way. Imagine you had a son or daughter or a friend, good friend, who came and told you that they had a potentially life-threatening cancerous tumor. Could you say to your friend, I want you to know I love you and I also love your tumor? It's like, no, I don't love your tumor. I want your tumor gone. I want your tumor out because I don't want you to die. Mm. So I don't understand Christians who believe what the Bible says here in Romans about homosexuality, but out of love for a son or daughter or a friend or other relative, they will not be consistent here and end up effectively loving the very thing that's sending those people to hell. We've got to be clear-minded about this and say, no, I do love you, I cherish you, and for that reason I cannot love that which is killing your soul.
Now, verse 28 is a powerful transition here to the idea of a debased mind leading to a depraved life. What is this debased mind that's described in verse 28? We see the language again of giving up. And what's the relationship between the debased mind and a depraved life?
Well, there's a direct connection in the Bible between how we think and how we live. And it's just good to know that as Christians. If you do something wrong with your body, it's because you first thought something wrong with your mind. So every time we repent, when we're convicted of sin, we need to trace it back to faulty thinking. And I think sometimes studying the tricks that Satan used to deceive us into doing those things, we're thinking wrongly. So here's a clear connection between a depraved mind and a depraved life or a corrupt life. And so, and it's a great tragedy because there is no more complex, beautiful, stunningly glorious, physical thing that God has ever made than the human mind. It is the pinnacle of his physical creation. And to have sin creep in like a nasty virus and so disease that beautiful, fearfully and wonderfully made mind, so the way we then think dark, evil, corrupted thoughts is a great tragedy. Yeah. Conversely, how beautiful it is to be transformed by the renewing of our minds and to be told now we have the mind of Christ, and to realize in glorification we'll have perfect minds that think only holy thoughts. That's where we're heading, and that's very hopeful. But here, this is not hopeful. This is diagnosis is what it is, and saying as God looks into the dark mind of the human race, he sees this flowing of a river of pollution into various tributaries, which we're about to discuss, but a depraved mind leads to a corrupt lifestyle.
Well, even following Paul's logic here, he says, because they did not see fit to acknowledge God, again, linking this back to the idea of that idolatry that we've been talking about, that God gave them up to this debased mind, and then it flows into them doing what ought not to be done.
And let's talk about that, ought. The word ought is, we're under obligation. And so the things that we're about to discuss, and that we have been discussing, idolatry and sexual immorality, homosexuality, ought not to happen. And so that's the moral imperative. God has the right to tell us what ought to happen and what ought not to happen. And so out of this depraved mind comes a whole bunch of things we ought not to do.
Now let's talk about the list. Starting in verse 29 here, what do the many different forms of evil described here teach us about human sin, and why are these particular sins listed that we get beginning in verse 29?
Yeah, I look at it again, just I say it again and again, I don't mind saying it as often as the opportunity comes up, of what I call the therapeutic view of salvation. Jesus said it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. So what we have here is basically a taxonomy or a listing of diseases. And Jesus is the physician of the soul. And so imagine if you're becoming a physician, general practitioner or internal medicine or something like that, you're going to study diseases. You're going to be aware of all the possible diseases you're likely to see in family practice, let's say. You know, you've got normal adults and growing kids, and they're coming in. What are the top 100 diseases you're likely to see? And they know them, and they know how to treat them, where medical science is for treating each of them, if possible. And so this is a listing of what sin has done in a varied way. It's a variegated list. And so all of the prohibitions, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. Those are all different sins. And so it's like they're different diseases, just as cancer and diabetes, some other disease I can't think of right now other than cancer, various forms like leukemia and all that. And all of those have different versions as well. You just have to be aware of the different types of diseases. And so I think it's to heighten our awareness of when we see these kinds of things in ourselves. And I would say, as we look at this list, it's impossible for any healthy Christian to look at this list and not feel convicted and say, these are some patterns I still, even now, see in my life.
Yeah. Verse 29 says they are filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. Like you said, we can look at some of these and be like, well, thankfully I don't see murder in my life. But then we think of even Jesus' words heightening hatred to this level of murder, or even just right next to murder in this text, envy. How often that can creep into our lives. He goes on at the end of verse 29, he says they're gossips, slanderers, and then he says haters of God. It's such a strong statement, but it's consistent, again, with this idea of idolatry, but now raised to an even more active description. It's not just passively not worshiping the Creator, but actively hating God. What's the significance of this language of being a hater of God? Why do people hate God?
It's so tragic because, but it makes sense because it's what we are made for. We are made to love God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And so sin must be the opposite. And if you don't love Him, you're going to hate Him. And so I think it could start with a sense and awareness of sin in your life, but you learn to kind of rethink it and not call it sin. And then you find out the truths of the Bible, and there's a God who will judge people for those sins, and the judgment is eternal conscious torment, burning in hell. Many non-Christians are aware of that. They're not afraid of it, but it makes them angry that would be a doctrine, and that there would be such a God who would do such a thing. They look on as the ultimate tyrant. And the more that they don't think about it often, but as often as they do think about it, it engenders loathing and disgust and revulsion and hatred. I remember reading something by Charles Darwin, and he was talking about hell and eternal conscious torment. And he says, I can't imagine why anyone would want such a thing to be true. Because if it's true, then my brother, my father, some of my best friends are in hell right now, burning. And that's intolerable. And so he hated the concept, and therefore I must say, with that attitude, he hates the God who would do such a thing. So, but aside from that, it's just you want autonomy, you want to rule your own world, and God is opposing you. God is fighting you. God's the enemy. He's the opposition. But it's just, I think it's evidence of a depraved mind. We were designed to love God, and with our minds twisted and evil and corrupt, we're going to hate that which is good and loving. And the clearest example of this, of course, is what they did to Jesus. I mean, you have this sense with Pontius Pilate where he's like, I don't understand what in the world you think this man has done. What did he do? Why? What crime has he committed? And he's the judge on the case. He's like, there's nothing, he's done nothing wrong. He says it again and again and again. And yet he condemns him to death out of expedience for himself. He had no personal animosity toward Jesus. But the chief priests, Annas, Caiaphas, they hated him. Oh, they hated him. And the Pharisees hated him when he, because he testified that what they did was evil. So there's here's light came into the world, and men love darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil. So there's this hatred of God.
And the common thread in the next three words here, insolent, haughty, boastful, it seems to be human pride. Why does God hate human boasting and pride so much?
Well, I want to begin by saying it's devilish. I think this is where it all started. I think that the first sin was idolatry by Satan of himself. He saw that he was wise, powerful, and beautiful, and thought he was better than all the other creatures, and thought he was so much better than all the other creatures, he actually thought he could topple God from his throne. So combining Ezekiel and Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 28, combining those oracles, it's like wickedness found in him as a guardian cherub, as Ezekiel, because of his beauty and wisdom. And he said, I will ascend and make myself like the Most High. Well, that's pride. And so therefore we, in imitating Satan, then become like our father, the devil. We become self-worshipers. We become insolent, arrogant, and boastful. And so God hates that. And what he wants is he wants to humble us, first of all, because it's reality. There is, in fact, an infinite gap between creator and creature. That's just real. And all the more now that we've sinned, there's a holiness gap where God is light and we have been darkness. And even if we're rescued out of it, we're done in such a way that we're completely humbled. But this is a list of sins now, and just the world is pulsating with self-worship and arrogance, and we see it everywhere.
Now, there's two more in verse 30 here that are a little bit interesting in being next to each other. We might not think of them in the same category. But all of this, again, I think is flowing from that idea of a debased mind. What does it mean that they are inventors of evil? And why is rebellion against parents listed here next to inventors of evil? These seem maybe a little bit different than one another, but they're both significant.
Yeah. Well, inventors of evil, inventing is to think of creative ways, new ways of doing something. An inventor, you think about Thomas Edison. And he invented new things, like over 1,000 patents. He was incredibly creative or inventive. In this case, that inventiveness is turned toward evil. It's like, here's something we could do. And it's amazing. Like you think about, I don't want to get into the ethics of it to some degree, but I'll say something. You think about the atomic bomb, all right? And what's happening is physics at that point is seeing that there's actually a possibility of splitting the atom, and that based on Einstein's theory of relativity and E equals mc squared, if that happens, it would be the release of tremendous amount of energy. All right, now, what is that energy that would be released going to be used for? And at that point, you're like, all right, now you're saying, oh, but that was, in the name of the democracies fighting against tyranny. I get it. I understand that. But still, if you think about what the atomic bomb did to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you look at what was left, and you look at the human lives that are completely incinerated, and you have to think big picture. War is evil. Big picture, the destruction of whole cities is evil. Big picture, death is evil. People know that. And so that would be an example. It's an inventor. It's like some thing of science, like how can we actually do this in a dark way? Yeah. And so it's using our minds creatively to then do something that's evil. You see this with Tower of Babel as well. They come up with the technology of baking bricks thoroughly, so they have a higher compression strength, and say, hey, let's build a tower to reach up to the heavens and make gods of ourselves. That's inventing evil. And then next to that is they disobey their parents, and so. That's where I say, if you can read this list and not be pricked to the heart, and you're not paying attention. Which of us didn't disobey our parents? It's the rich young ruler. And Jesus said, honor your father and mother. Oh, all these I've kept since I was a boy. It's like, yeah, well, so maybe you say you disobeyed when you were a boy, but since then, 100%. Doubt it. So, but we read this list and we have to say, look, this is all of us. Yeah. But I also think it's one of the most important ways we get into the moral life, all right? You have young children, all right? Are you training them to obey you guys?
Yes.
How's that going?
It is a daily sanctifying journey.
Right. And you would have to say, and I would say too, without throwing our children under the bus directly, but they do not always obey us. And so early on, it's one of the first lessons a child gets in terms of his or her own sinfulness. And so I think it's foundational. So fundamental is they needed to learn from the beginning to obey their parents. And also, I would have to say, it's one of the most important functions of parenting. You have to make your children obey you. You can't punt on that, because they have to, by obeying you, they're obeying God, and they need to learn that. But yet this list says they disobey their parents.
Now, you talked about the therapeutic view of salvation and God's goal in really sanctification upon our salvation. In verse 31, Paul lists four words that are all negatives in the Greek: foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. What does this show about the effects of sin on the human heart? And then what does it teach us about God's goal in sanctification and redemption?
Well, you're looking at the heart. Your first word was foolish. My translation says senseless. So there's just idiocy. I mean, the things that people do. You could think of an addict, and he's trying to get out of the pattern of addiction, and he has managed to put 6-9 months, a year between himself and his last indulgence of his drink or drug of choice, and then in a moment of weakness, so to speak, he does a very foolish thing, and next thing you know, he's right back in addiction. It was very foolish. We say foolish things. It's like we're not even aware, like we're really, really stupid, like we're unreasoning beasts, and we don't know where this whole thing is going. And so that's the idea of being foolish or senseless. Faithless, is that what your second word says? Faithless?
Yes.
Okay, that to me means we don't keep our promises. If you're faithful, means you can be trusted. And faithless here to me means you're not trustworthy. It could be that you have no faith, no saving faith. But I think in this context here, it means more of a bad character, and you can't be trusted. So the Book of Proverbs says, if you send a fool as a messenger, you're gonna deeply regret it. All right. So here's a guy that he's not faithful. All right, so they're faithless. And then heartless and ruthless go together to me. I think basically it's just you're cold inside. You're not moved. You see someone suffering, it doesn't mean anything. It's just really sick. You see these films of German soldiers that were killing innocent people and laughing or joking about it, or it became a game. And it was interesting. The final solution for the Jews, the machinery, the German efficiency and all that, from what I learned, it was initially done to protect the German soldiers from needing to kill innocent people with their own hands, because it did something to their characters. They became much worse soldiers. They were not obedient to their commanders because they were corrupted by doing these things. And it's like we got to take this away from the German soldier. And I think that was an example of a basic innate morality, even in that evil time where they knew they were doing wrong. And I think that's what it means to be heartless and ruthless. You have no compassion for your fellow man.
All right, we've got one more verse to look at here as we wrap up this passage. So I want to read it, and then I have a twofold question that I think will help us get at the heart of what's going on here. Though they know God's righteous decree, Paul says, that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. So how do they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die? And why do they keep on doing these very things and show approval to those who practice them?
Well, the answer to your first question, how do they know that those who do such things deserve death, is that God has put that knowledge within them, as he will make it very plain in chapter 2, because they have a conscience, and their conscience sometimes accuses, sometimes defends them. And so they have an awareness. Secondly, conscience is pointing the finger at you. The corollary is what some ethicists call the judicial instinct, points the finger at others. You look at others and you say, that was wrong, that was selfish, that was cruel. Like a teenager that pushes a little old lady down on the sidewalk and laughs. It's like, that's ruthless. Yeah, that could be said by an overt non-Christian, but they know it's what they did was wrong, so they're judging someone else. And Paul's about to talk about you who judge others, do not judge yourself. Not saying you're wrong. It was ruthless, but what about you? Are you ruthless? So they have a sense of it. And then you have this sense of again, the ultimate paragon of evil, Adolf Hitler, and you think, so he takes the cyanide capsule and he's out of it? He escapes justice? Really? Where he puts a bullet in his brain, boom, no, like instant, no pain, he's done? Well, what if there's a hell? It's like, I'd be all up for that for Hitler. So we're wanting Hitler to burn in hell forever and ever. So these are non-Christians who are very aware of the doctrine. They just don't want it coming back on themselves.
Yeah.
Don't think they're not anywhere near as bad as Hitler. They don't deserve hell. But they know that people who do such things deserve death. Yet, despite that, they approve of them. They do them themselves, and they laugh and think it's fun and are excited and egg on other people to do it. And so they're just immersed in a system. And this, by the way, is what the world is all about. If you think about the world, we got the three enemies: world, flesh, devil. World is other humans. And what is other humans? The world, in that sense, it's negative, it's evil, inciting us to sin. Look at this verse. That's what's going on. Those are people who know God's righteous decree that those who do these kinds of things deserve death, but they do them themselves and approve of and actually aid and abet people from doing it themselves. That's what the world's all about.
Andy, we've covered a lot of ground in these verses today. What final thoughts do you have for us on this passage?
Well, actually, as you were reading, I felt like I could cry. I felt that. I thought, this is a shameful list. It really is. Because God is so good, and he made such a beautiful world, so much evidence of his goodness, and we don't love him, and we don't thank him, we don't serve him. Instead, we do all this. And then along with that, a sense of shame, because I've been included in this. I've done it. And it's just like, but then it can't stay that way for long. And a sense of awe and wonder that Jesus would take this filth on himself. He who is the only pure man that ever lived took that filth on himself, and then the lightning strike of God's holy wrath on himself, so that I could be free and not be ashamed. So in the end, thankfulness to Christ for what he did for me.
Well, this has been episode 3 in our Romans Bible Study podcast. We want to invite you to join us next time for episode 4, where we'll discuss Romans chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. Thank you for listening to the Two Journeys podcast, and may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all.
Stay motivated to grow to spiritual maturity by accessing free biblical content at twojourneys.org. Help others in their spiritual growth by sharing these resources, praying for Two Journeys, and supporting the mission financially by visiting twojourneys.org/donate.